So we are continuing in our series on Old Testament kings. And I noticed as I was preparing these sermons that I haven't found video clips to match the themes of the sermons. Now, either one or two things has happened. Number one, I've forgotten how to use Google, which I don't think is the case. Or number two, it tells me that as Christians in this century, we aren't doing a whole lot with the Old Testament. We're spending a lot of time with the New Testament, which is great, but the Old Testament came first and laid the foundation for the New Testament. We really can't understand our Christian faith without understanding the Old Testament and without getting. That's one of the reasons, friends, why you need to be in a Bible study. You can't get it all on Sunday morning. You can't understand everything that we're saying on Sunday morning. And that's one of the great things about a study like Disciple Bible, is that it covers the entire Scriptures. And it tells you about the foundation. It's a story. It's a story of God's work from the beginning of time forward. And the if you just showed up, and all of a sudden there's this city that just pops up. You're driving along one of your familiar routes, and bang, there's a city sitting there. Well, what's the first thing? Well, how did that get there, right? Who planned it? Who laid it out? Whose idea was it? And see, if we just start with the cross and we don't understand everything that's gone before, it's like we're riding along with it, bam, all of a sudden there's a church or a faith in front. We don't get it. We can't possibly grasp everything that we need to grasp about our faith in Christ without understanding the Old Testament, because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament prophecies. You with me? He's who they're talking about when they're saying that David's going to have an unending line of heirs and that his throne will be everlasting. It's Jesus. But we can't get that. We just think it's one king after another. And if that's the case, as we'll discover this morning, there are some really bad guys that inherited the throne along the way. So there has to be that connection between the old and the new. There has to be that continuous journey, or else we think, man, God really messed up on that one. That king should have been kicked out the line, until we understand that Jesus is the culmination of that promise. A lot of us this week watched with intrigue and horror at the discovery and pursuit and death of Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, what have we become where we show these pictures on television? And I'm glad the guy's gone, I'll be honest with you. I think that there was no way to get rid of him, but eventually put him to death. Saddam Hussein met his maker. All these things I think need to happen, but good grief. On television, really? And Gaddafi began this 42-year rule of his people using terror and torture as a means to supposedly gain control and intimidate people. In the end, these same people were the ones that hunted him down. They found him in a drainage pipe of all places, much like Saddam Hussein hiding in a hole. Gaddafi and Hussein were probably the closest things that we have to despot kings in this stage of human history. If we want to relate the bad kings of Israel's time to current day, those two guys would be tops on the list probably. I know they weren't, kings, but they used the same kinds of tactics as some of the really bad kings in Israel's day did. They both met their fates, and their countries are facing uncertain futures, but they have promise and hope in those countries now because the despot kings have been deposed. Now, in our series on the biblical kings, we concentrated on the good kings, right? We've talked about the good guys so far. We talked about Solomon. Now Saul was good to bad, right? Kind of went both ways there. Solomon good, David good. And it's good for us to talk about the good kings because there's not that many of them, first of all. And there's way more bad kings than we realize. In fact, Kings Hezekiah and Josiah are remembered as the only two truly good kings. There were some that started off good and turned bad. There were some that were kind of mediocre, good, bad. And then there were some that were just bad from the beginning. And Hezekiah and Josiah, who we will talk about today, are the ones that are remembered as the really, really good kings. In fact, I came across this little thing online showing the good kings and the bad kings. And the list for the good kings was about that long. The bad kings, and the good kings was about this long. There's way more bad stuff going on during that period of history than good stuff. But today's king was a good king. He was a very good king. And his name was Josiah. And he led one of the most powerful revivals in biblical history. Now, how many of you can remember the days when Billy Graham held revival crusades. You remember those? None of us are that old, right, that we don't remember those things. I can remember as a kid sitting on the floor at my grandparents' house watching the Billy Graham crusades and all the music, and Cliff Barrows and the same song leaders, the same people. It was just comforting, wasn't it, to watch those things. And Dr. Graham always brought just a great challenging word. And then at the end of his message, the floodgates would open. And it was just really, really cool. Back in the day, revival meetings would last a couple of weeks, sometimes a month, when a revival would take place. I mean, people didn't have much else to do. Once you had, plowed the fields, and bashed your laundry on a rock, you just standing around. So they'd have a revival meeting, right? And it would last, a month. And then, as time went on, it dropped down to 2 weeks and then a week. And by the time I started knowing anything about revivals and preaching revivals myself, it was Sunday night through Tuesday. That's all we could stand. That's all the revival, I want about 1.5 pounds of God in my week. Give me Sunday through Tuesday. I don't want enough to mess up my world or anything. Occasionally, they still have camp meetings. I did one this summer that lasts for a week, and I preached like 5 days of that camp meeting. But for the most part, people are just too busy for revival, right? We got things to do. I can't be out every night of the week. What, are you kidding me? Be at church every night of the week? I'm busy. I got shows to watch. I got ball games. People are too busy. We're too busy. And it's interesting to me that at a time when we need revival the most, we're too busy for revival. Would you agree with that? Would you agree that the church in America needs revival today? Would you agree that we are in desperate need of revival today? And yet, for some reason, we're just too busy. Too busy. Well, we're going to talk about a time when revival kind of snuck up on the folks. But it didn't really, because there were some things going on and some things taking place that encouraged that revival. And I want to share those principles or keys, if you will, to revival with you today. Now, you have to understand who Josiah was. He was a great king, but he was a child king. He started being king at 8 years old. Now, I don't know about you. Think about the 8-year-old boys in your life. Want any of them running the country? No, I didn't think so. Must have been a different day and a different age. And you see, Josiah didn't come from a really good family either. His father, Ammon, was a bad king. He was in fact, it says, King Ammon was evil in God's eyes. Now, whether you know much about biblical history or not, okay, if your name appears in the Bible, you don't want the words immediately after your name to be, you did what was evil in God's eyes. That's not good, okay? So not only was his dad a bad guy, but his granddad. Anybody remember King Manasseh? He was a horrible guy. Manasseh put an Asherah pole on the altar of God in the temple. Oh, my goodness. And not only did he worship the foreign gods out there in the lands around, but he also, on the altar of God, put an Asherah pole. Oh, it was just a terror. And he murdered anybody that opposed him. He put the sword to. They did infant sacrifices. They worshiped the god of Moloch. I mean, these were bad, bad people. And yet, God used the son of Ammon and Manasseh to bring about one of the greatest revivals in biblical history. But there's some things going on in Josiah's life that helped that along.